It was a bright, crisp morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of day where the sunlight danced on the Potomac River, and the city buzzed with its usual mix of ambition and unease. In the heart of the city, the atmosphere was far from ordinary. A casual misunderstanding was about to spiral into a shocking event that would grip the nation. James Marshall, a seasoned police officer with 2 decades on the force, was on routine patrol. He prided himself on his sharp instincts and adherence to protocol, a no-nonsense cop who believed in the rule of law. But beneath his composed exterior lay a man battling with the unspoken pressures of the job, long hours, dangerous calls, and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. For James, today felt like just another shift until he spotted an unfamiliar car parked near a high-security government building. At first glance, there was nothing overtly suspicious about the sleek, black sedan with tinted windows. But as James approached, he noticed the driver, a sharply dressed black man in his mid-40s, seated calmly inside. The man appeared to be typing on a laptop, his brow furrowed in focus. To James, the scene raised questions. What business could this man have here? And why did he seem so unconcerned about being parked in such a restricted area? James knocked on the window, signaling for the man to roll it down. The driver, whose name was Elijah Pierce, glanced up, clearly startled by the interruption. Elijah was not just any individual. He was the recently appointed director of the CIA, a man tasked with some of the nation's most sensitive responsibilities. But Elijah wasn't wearing a badge or uniform that morning. He had decided to blend in, thinking his credentials wouldn't matter during a brief stop to review critical files before his next meeting. "Good morning, officer," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. He reached into his jacket to retrieve his identification, knowing the drill all too well. But before he could fully explain himself, James's demeanor shifted. Perhaps it was the weight of his own assumptions or the pressure to act swiftly, but the officer's tone became authoritative. "Step out of the vehicle," James ordered. The request caught Elijah off guard. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Elijah replied, holding out his government-issued ID. But James barely glanced at the credentials. Out of the car now, he insisted, his hand hovering near his holster. By now, a small crowd had begun to gather, their phones raised as they recorded the unfolding scene. Whispers of disbelief filled the air. "Isn't that the CIA director?" someone murmured. But James, focused on asserting control, didn't seem to notice or care. Elijah, aware of the volatile nature of such encounters, complied, stepping out of the car with deliberate, measured movements. The tension was palpable. Elijah could feel the weight of every gaze on him, from the spectators to the officer standing just feet away. This wasn't the first time Elijah had faced such scrutiny, but it was, perhaps, the most surreal. Here he was, the head of one of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world, being treated like a suspect on the street. As James began to question Elijah, the situation grew even more precarious. The officer's voice carried a mix of suspicion and doubt, while Elijah's responses were calm yet unwavering. "I'm the director of the CIA," he stated again, his voice steady but firm. James shook his head, as if the notion was too far-fetched to believe. "Prove it," he demanded. Elijah gestured toward his car, where additional documentation was stored, but James cut him off. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their disapproval evident. "He's telling the truth," someone shouted. But James was resolute, determined not to back down. What happened next would set off a firestorm of controversy that reverberated far beyond the streets of D.C. It wasn't just a moment of misunderstanding. It became a flashpoint for discussions about race, authority, and the deep-seated biases that linger in the shadows of society. For James Marshall, this day would mark the unraveling of his once sterling career. And for Elijah Pierce, it was a stark reminder that even the highest office couldn't shield him from the realities faced by so many others. As the video clips from that day circulated online, igniting debates and protests across the nation, one question loomed large. How could something like this happen? And what would the consequences be, not just for the individuals involved, but for a nation already grappling with division? Stay tuned to find out how this gripping story unfolds as we delve deeper into the incident that changed two lives and sparked a conversation that couldn't be ignored. As the scene unfolded on the busy Washington street, Elijah Pierce stood still, his hands raised slightly as James Marshall continued to scrutinize him. The crowd around them grew larger, murmurs rippling through the gathering. Some recorded with their phones, while others exchanged incredulous looks. The tension in the air was so thick that it felt like a storm was about to break. Elijah's thoughts raced. He had faced challenges before, both personal and professional, but this situation was unlike anything he had ever experienced. As the CIA director, he was accustomed to high-stakes scenarios, covert operations, and the burden of keeping national secrets. But here, stripped of his authority and reduced to just another face in the crowd, he found himself grappling with a reality he hadn't faced in years. It wasn't about his position anymore, it was about something far deeper. James, meanwhile, felt his pulse quicken. He could sense the crowd's disapproval, but he was determined to maintain control. His training told him to remain firm, to ensure the situation didn't escalate. Yet a nagging doubt began to creep into his mind. What if this man was telling the truth? Could he have just detained the CIA director? But James pushed the thought aside, unwilling to back down without absolute certainty. "Where are you heading?" James asked, his voice sharp and demanding. Elijah, still holding his composure, replied, "To a briefing at Langley. I stopped here for a moment to review some documents. My identification is in the car. Why didn't you show it earlier?" James shot back, his tone laced with suspicion. Elijah exhaled, his patience wearing thin. "I did," he said evenly, "but you didn't look at it." The exchange only fueled the growing tension in the crowd. More voices began to rise, some defending Elijah, others questioning James' actions. "This is ridiculous," someone shouted. "He's not a threat." Another voice chimed in, "Why does this keep happening? Why can't they just listen?" The incident was quickly becoming more than a mere confrontation. It was a symbol of something larger, something deeply embedded in the fabric of society. Elijah could feel the weight of those unspoken struggles pressing down on him. He had spent years climbing to the pinnacle of his career, breaking barriers and shattering stereotypes. Yet in this moment, none of it seemed to matter. James reached for his radio, calling for backup. "I need assistance," he said tersely, his eyes scanning the crowd as if expecting trouble. The move only heightened the tension, and Elijah could see some members of the crowd bristling at the officer's actions. Among the bystanders was a young woman named Maya, a freelance journalist who happened to be passing by. She had initially stopped out of curiosity, but as she pieced together what was happening, she felt compelled to act. Maya wasn't just recording the scene. She was asking questions, trying to understand the dynamics at play. Her instincts told her this was more than just an isolated event. It was a story that needed to be told. As Maya moved closer, she caught Elijah's eye. There was a silent exchange between them, a flicker of understanding that passed without words. Maya turned her camera toward him, capturing not just the events but the emotions, the quiet dignity with which Elijah held himself, the frustration etched on his face, and the mounting anger in the crowd. James, noticing her approach, barked, "Step back, ma'am." This is a police matter. But Maya didn't budge. "Officer, do you realize who this man is?" she asked, her voice steady but pointed. James hesitated, the question landing like a blow. "I'm handling this," he replied, his tone defensive. Maya pressed on, her voice growing louder. "This man is Elijah Pierce. He's the director of the CIA. You're detaining one of the most powerful people in the country. Do you understand what you're doing right now?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The crowd fell silent, their eyes shifting from Maya to James, and back to Elijah. James's face hardened, a mix of disbelief and defiance. "I need to confirm that," he said, his voice faltering slightly. Elijah, who had remained silent during Maya's exchange, finally spoke. "Officer, you've had my ID from the beginning. You can call Langley right now. They'll confirm everything." His voice was calm but carried an edge that suggested his patience was running out. James hesitated, the weight of the situation finally starting to sink in. The arrival of additional officers only added to the pressure. They approached cautiously, assessing the scene and exchanging brief glances with James. One of them, a younger officer named Daniels, leaned in to speak quietly. "James, are you sure about this?" "I think she's right." James didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led to this moment. Doubt was creeping in, but his pride in training made it hard to admit he might have made a mistake. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the tension nearing a breaking point. And then, as if to cut through the chaos, Elijah spoke again. "Officer, I've tried to cooperate. I've remained calm. But I need you to understand the gravity of this situation, not just for me, but for you, for everyone here." His words were measured, almost deliberate, and they seemed to resonate with the crowd. For James, however, they landed differently. The authority in Elijah's tone felt like a challenge, and James wasn't sure how to respond. Maya continued recording, her mind racing with thoughts of how this would play out. She knew the story would explode once it hit the internet. But for her, this wasn't just about clicks or views. It was about shining a light on the deeper issues at play. And just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A black SUV pulled up, its tinted windows gleaming under the midday sun. The door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out, his expression serious but composed. He walked directly toward James and Elijah, holding up a badge that left no room for doubt. "I'm Special Agent Carter with the Secret Service," he announced. This man is indeed the director of the CIA. The revelation hit like a lightning bolt. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. James's face turned pale, the realization of his mistake dawning on him. But the story was far from over. For Elijah, the damage had been done. And for James, the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. As the words left Special Agent Carter's lips, the energy in the air shifted dramatically. For the crowd, the confirmation felt like vindication, proof of what many had suspected all along. For James Marshall, it was like the ground beneath him had opened up. He stood frozen, his thoughts a chaotic blur. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no words came. Instead, he was acutely aware of the stares, some angry, some judgmental, and some simply shocked. Elijah Pierce, though outwardly composed, felt a storm brewing inside him. The humiliation of being detained in such a public manner was not lost on him. But Elijah had learned long ago how to channel his anger, how to navigate a world where even his highest accomplishments couldn't always shield him. He glanced at the crowd, at the cameras still rolling, and at James, whose rigid stance betrayed his internal conflict. Elijah's instincts told him this moment wasn't just personal. It was about something much larger. Special Agent Carter stepped closer to Elijah, lowering his voice. "Director Pierce, are you all right? Do you need anything?" Elijah shook his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said, his tone even, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration. "But we need to address this properly." The agent nodded, understanding the weight of Elijah's words. He turned to James and the other officers, his demeanor calm but firm. "You've made a serious error," he said, addressing James directly. "I suggest you step back and let us handle this from here." James opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Daniels, the younger officer, interjected. "Maybe we should just de-escalate and let them go, James." His voice was cautious, but carried a note of urgency. James hesitated, torn between his instinct to assert control and the reality that he had overstepped. Finally, he stepped back, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of the situation bore down on him. As the officers retreated, Maya seized the moment to approach Elijah. Her camera was still rolling, but her voice softened. "Director Pierce, do you have anything you'd like to say? The whole country's going to see this." Elijah regarded her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He wasn't sure how much he wanted to say, but he knew this was an opportunity to address something bigger than his personal experience. "Maya, is it?" he asked, and she nodded, surprised that he had caught her name. "What happened here today isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady but resonant. "It's about assumptions, about biases, and about the need for accountability. We all have a responsibility to do better for each other and for this country." Maya's camera captured every word, and she could already imagine the impact it would have. But even as Elijah spoke, his mind was working through the implications of what had just happened. He knew this incident would make headlines, that it would spark debates and ignite tensions. But more than that, he knew it would test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, James sat in his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He replayed the events in his mind, trying to pinpoint the moment things had gone wrong. He thought about the years he had spent on the force, the countless split-second decisions he had made, and the reasons he had joined the department in the first place. But none of it felt like enough to justify what had happened today. At the precinct, the news was already spreading. Footage of the incident was going viral, and calls were flooding in from reporters and citizens alike. Chief Morales, a seasoned leader with a deep commitment to community relations, watched the clips in silence, her face unreadable. She knew the department's reputation was on the line, and she also knew James would need to answer for his actions. Back on the street, Elijah finally returned to his car, flanked by Special Agent Carter and two other agents who had arrived as backup. As the crowd began to disperse, he sat behind the wheel for a moment, taking a deep breath. He glanced at the folder of documents on the passenger seat, a reminder of the high-stakes briefing he was now late for. But for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt the weight of something even more pressing than his work. He turned to Carter, his voice low but firm. "We need to make sure this doesn't just disappear. This can't be swept under the rug." Carter nodded, understanding the dual meaning behind Elijah's words. It wasn't just about holding James accountable. It was about addressing the systemic issues that had led to the incident in the first place. As Elijah drove off, the echoes of the confrontation lingered in his mind. He thought about the young journalist, Maya, and how she had stepped forward when others hesitated. He thought about the crowd, whose collective voice had made a difference. And he thought about James, whose actions reflected not just individual bias, but a larger societal problem. Elijah knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a much larger fight. The city was buzzing with the aftermath of the incident. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, and within hours, the footage had made its way onto every major network. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags trended. Debates raged in the comments, and the country found itself divided once again. For some, the video was proof of the deep-seated issues that still plagued law enforcement and society as a whole. For others, it was a question of context, a debate over whether one mistake should define a man's career. James Marshall found himself at the center of it all, a position he never imagined he'd be in. As he sat in a small conference room at the precinct, the reality of his situation began to sink in. Chief Morales had called him in for a meeting, and the tone of her voice when she summoned him left little room for optimism. He glanced at his phone, which hadn't stopped buzzing since the story broke. Messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers flooded his inbox, some offering support, others condemning him outright. When the door opened, Chief Morales walked in, her expression unreadable. She set a folder on the table and took a seat across from James. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, each second stretching out longer than the last. Finally, she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "James," she began, her voice steady but firm, "we need to talk about what happened today." James nodded, his throat dry. "I know I made a mistake," he said quietly. "But I didn't mean—" Chief Morales held up a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't just about what you meant. It's about what you did. And it's about the impact of your actions, not just on you, but on this department and this community." James felt a pang of defensiveness, but forced himself to stay quiet. He knew she was right, even if admitting it felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. Chief Morales opened the folder and slid a sheet of paper across the table. It was a formal notice of suspension, effective immediately. James stared at it, his stomach sinking. "This isn't permanent," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But we have to take this seriously. There's going to be an investigation, and the public needs to see that we're holding ourselves accountable." James nodded again, his mind racing. He wanted to plead his case, to explain that he had been acting on instinct, that he hadn't known who Elijah Pierce was. But deep down, he knew those excuses wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. Meanwhile, Elijah Pierce was navigating his own set of challenges. His office at Langley was a far cry from the chaotic scene on the street, but the weight of the incident followed him there. Calls poured in from allies and critics alike, some offering solidarity, others demanding explanations. He had spent years building a reputation as a calm and measured leader, and now he found himself thrust into the spotlight in a way he hadn't anticipated. Elijah's chief of staff, Sarah Mitchell, entered the room with a tablet in hand. "Director, the footage has gone viral," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "The president's office has called. They want to know how you want to handle this." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew that whatever he said or did next would set the tone for how this incident was remembered. But it wasn't just about him. It was about the broader issues it represented, issues he couldn't ignore. "I'll draft a statement," he said finally. "But I want it to be more than just words. We need to address this in a way that leads to real change." Sarah nodded, impressed by his resolve. "Understood," she said. "But we need to move quickly. The narrative is already taking shape." As Elijah worked on his statement, Maya was busy piecing together her report. The footage she had captured was raw and powerful, but she wanted to go deeper. She spent hours researching James Marshall's background, looking for context that might help the audience understand the man behind the badge. What she found surprised her: commendations, years of community service, and a reputation as a fair and diligent officer. But she also found complaints, small cracks in the otherwise solid facade. Maya knew her piece would be controversial no matter how she framed it. But she also knew it was important to tell the full story, to capture the complexity of what had happened. As she edited her footage, she couldn't shake the image of Elijah standing tall amidst the chaos, his voice calm but commanding. The tension between the two men, Elijah's composed authority and James's defensive rigidity, felt emblematic of something larger. It wasn't just about one officer and one civilian. It was about the systems that had shaped them, the forces that had brought them to that moment, and the fractures in society that the incident had laid bare. As the hours ticked by, the anticipation only grew. News anchors debated the incident on live television, analysts weighed in with their perspectives, and ordinary citizens took to social media to share their thoughts. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, how James would respond, how Elijah would lead, and whether this moment would spark change or simply fade into the noise of the news cycle. For James, the question loomed heavy. Could he salvage his career and reputation, or was this the beginning of the end? For Elijah, the stakes were just as high. Would his response be enough to inspire action, or would it be dismissed as just another statement from a leader under fire? The stage was set, the players in place, and the world was watching. But no one could predict how the story would unfold or what the ultimate cost would be for everyone involved. As the world dissected the now infamous footage of Elijah Pierce and James Marshall, a new element emerged that no one had anticipated. Late in the evening, Maya received an anonymous email. The subject line simply read, "You need to see this." Attached to the message was a video file and a cryptic note. The truth isn't always what it seems. Curiosity overtook her as she opened the file. The grainy footage appeared to be from a body camera, but it wasn't James's. It showed an earlier interaction between James and another man, just moments before Elijah's detainment. The man in the video wore a dark hoodie and had been pacing near the same cafe where Elijah had parked his car. James approached him, asking for ID, but the man bolted, sprinting down the street before disappearing into an alley. The video cut off abruptly, leaving Maya stunned. This new footage added an unexpected layer to the story. Had James been on edge from the earlier encounter? Had he mistaken Elijah's calm demeanor for something else because of that interaction? Maya didn't know, but one thing was clear. This was crucial context that no one else had seen yet. Meanwhile, Elijah was wrapping up a call with the president's office when Sarah re-entered his office, her face pale. "Director, you need to see this," she said, placing a tablet in front of him. It was an internal report from the Department of Justice, flagged as urgent. The document revealed that James Marshall had been under investigation for several months regarding his handling of prior stops. While none had escalated to the level of this incident, a pattern of questionable judgment and implicit bias was noted. Elijah read the report carefully, his jaw tightening. He understood the gravity of the situation more than most. This wasn't just about James anymore. It was about a system that allowed such patterns to persist unchecked. But there was another concern gnawing at the back of his mind. If this information leaked, it could escalate tensions further, potentially causing unrest. And yet, withholding it felt equally problematic, a betrayal of the transparency Elijah valued deeply. Across town, James sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the suspension notice on his kitchen table. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional ping of his phone. He had stopped checking the messages hours ago. The mix of anger and support was too much to process. Just as he was about to pour himself another cup of coffee, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, he was surprised to see Daniel standing there. The young officer looked uneasy, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I need to talk to you." Daniels said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Something's not adding up. James frowned, motioning for Daniels to sit. What do you mean? Daniels hesitated, glancing at the floor before meeting James's eyes. That guy who ran earlier, before you stopped Pierce. I've been thinking about it. What if he had something to do with this? What if Pierce wasn't just a random target? James felt a chill run down his spine. It was a possibility he hadn't considered. You're saying the guy who ran might have planted something in Pierce's car, or was watching him? James asked, his voice low. Daniels nodded. It's a stretch, I know, but it's worth looking into. If nothing else, it might explain why you were on edge. The idea seemed far-fetched, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels might be onto something. He decided to dig through his notes from earlier, searching for any details that could corroborate the theory. But as he pieced together the timeline, something else caught his attention. The description of the man in the hoodie matched a suspect in an ongoing federal investigation, a case Elijah himself had been overseeing. Back at Langley, Elijah's phone buzzed with a message from Special Agent Carter. The words were brief but chilling. We've identified a potential security breach tied to today's incident. Need to debrief immediately. Elijah's heart sank. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, revealing a picture far more complex than he had anticipated. What had started as a personal confrontation was beginning to look like part of a larger scheme, one that could have implications for national security. The revelation left everyone reeling. Maya debated whether to release the body cam footage, knowing it could complicate the narrative. Elijah braced himself for what Carter would uncover in the debrief. And James, torn between guilt and a growing suspicion that he had been played, began to question everything he thought he knew about the day's events. As the night wore on, the stakes rose higher than anyone had imagined. What had seemed like a singular incident was now tied to a larger web of intrigue, one that threatened to unravel everything Elijah and James stood for. Yet the truth remained elusive, just out of reach, leaving all of them hurtling toward an inevitable confrontation that would change everything. As dawn broke over the city, the tension from the day before had reached a boiling point. Elijah Pierce sat in a secure conference room at Langley, flanked by Special Agent Carter and a team of intelligence analysts. The evidence they had pieced together overnight painted a troubling picture. The man in the hoodie, identified as Marcus Graves, was not just a random suspect. He was a known operative for a shadowy organization suspected of sabotaging high-profile figures to sow discord within the U.S. government. Graves had been under surveillance for months, but his actions the previous day raised new questions. The analysts traced his movements and discovered he had lingered near Elijah's car long enough to plant something. Within moments, a forensic team was dispatched to the vehicle. The discovery sent shockwaves through the room. A small but sophisticated tracking device had been hidden under the car's rear bumper. It was clear that Elijah had been targeted, but the motive remained unclear. Meanwhile, James Marshall was called back to the precinct for questioning. Chief Morales, now fully aware of the larger implications, met him with an unusual mix of sternness and concern. James, we need to talk, she began, motioning him into her office. On her desk was a file marked with the Department of Justice seal. As Morales explained the connection between Marcus Graves and the device found on Elijah's car, James's face went pale. The realization hit him hard. His actions, however misguided, had inadvertently intersected with something far bigger than a simple traffic stop. He began to recount everything he remembered about the interaction with Graves, including the man's erratic behavior and sudden flight. Morales listened carefully, her expression grim. "This isn't just about you anymore," she said finally. "It's about protecting the integrity of this department and ensuring we don't let a situation like this spiral further out of control. At the same time, Maya was finalizing her report. She had decided to include the body cam footage, but with a carefully crafted narrative that balanced the complexities of the situation. She knew the public deserved the full story, even if it meant complicating the initial perception. Just as she was about to upload the piece, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Be careful. The truth has consequences." The warning rattled her, but Maya wasn't one to back down. Instead, she doubled down, ensuring her report was accurate and nuanced. She included a segment highlighting the discovery of the tracking device, weaving it into a broader commentary on the systemic and personal challenges faced by everyone involved. As the day unfolded, the story reached its climax. Elijah called for a joint press conference, determined to address the public directly. Flanked by Chief Morales and Special Agent Carter, he stood before a sea of cameras and reporters. The tension in the room was palpable as he began to speak. What happened yesterday was a confluence of individual actions, systemic challenges, and deliberate interference by external actors, Elijah said, his voice steady but firm. He detailed the events, emphasizing the discovery of the tracking device and the role it played in escalating the situation. This is not just about one officer or one individual. It's about ensuring that we confront these issues head-on with transparency and accountability. As Elijah finished, James stepped forward, visibly nervous but resolute. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I acted on assumptions instead of facts, and I failed to uphold the standards I believe in as an officer. For that, I'm sorry." His apology was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as genuine, others as too little, too late. But just as the conference seemed to be winding down, Carter leaned over and whispered something to Elijah. He nodded, his expression darkening. Stepping back to the microphone, he delivered the twist no one expected. "We've just received confirmation that Marcus Graves was not acting alone," he said. "This was part of a coordinated effort to undermine trust in our institutions. The investigation is ongoing, but let me be clear. We will not be intimidated or divided." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room and beyond. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward case of racial profiling and overreach was now intertwined with a larger conspiracy. The nation watched, transfixed, as the story continued to unfold, its implications growing more profound with each passing moment. As the press conference ended, Elijah and James exchanged a brief glance. It wasn't one of reconciliation, but of mutual understanding. They were both caught in a storm far greater than themselves, and for better or worse, their lives would never be the same. In the days following the press conference, the dust began to settle, though the weight of what had transpired still lingered. The public response was as divided as ever, but there was also a growing realization that the incident had exposed cracks in more than just personal judgment. It had peeled back layers of systemic issues, leaving the nation with questions it could no longer afford to ignore. Elijah Pierce returned to Langley with a renewed sense of purpose. The tracking device found on his car was traced to an international network specializing in destabilization tactics, but their motives for targeting him remained murky. Still, the discovery gave him leverage to push for increased resources in addressing domestic vulnerabilities. In a private meeting with the president, Elijah made it clear that the country's internal divisions were being exploited and that it was time for meaningful reforms. "This isn't just about my position or my safety," Elijah said, his voice calm but insistent. "This is about protecting the fabric of who we are as a nation. If we let these moments define us without learning from them, we'll be giving our enemies exactly what they want." The president nodded, visibly moved by Elijah's words. Within weeks, a task force was formed to investigate external threats to national unity, with Elijah playing a key advisory role. The move was widely seen as a step in the right direction, though Elijah knew the road ahead would be long and complicated. James Marshall's journey was no less transformative. His suspension remained in place as the internal investigation continued, but the public apology had softened some of the backlash. In the quiet weeks that followed, James took a hard look at himself and the choices he had made. He enrolled in implicit bias training and began volunteering with community programs focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities. It was a small start, but it felt meaningful. One day, while walking out of a community center, James ran into Maya. She was there interviewing attendees for a follow-up piece. For a moment, they both hesitated, unsure of how to approach each other. Then Maya extended her hand. "Officer Marshall," she said, her tone measured but not unfriendly. "I wasn't sure we'd meet again." "Just James," he replied, shaking her hand. "And yeah, I wasn't sure either." They ended up sitting on a bench outside, talking for nearly an hour. Maya was honest about her initial anger and frustration, but she also acknowledged that James's willingness to own his mistakes had shifted her perspective. For his part, James expressed gratitude for Maya's reporting, even if it had put him under a microscope. "It forced me to see things I was blind to," he admitted. By the time they parted ways, there was a sense of mutual respect, if not full reconciliation. As for Maya, the story propelled her career to new heights. Her balanced reporting earned widespread praise, and she was invited to speak at journalism panels about the importance of capturing nuance in a world that often favored black and white narratives. But the work itself remained her priority. She continued to follow up on the systemic issues highlighted by the incident, determined to keep the conversation alive long after the headlines faded. In the broader community, the incident sparked difficult but necessary conversations. Town halls were organized, bringing together police officers, activists, and residents to share their perspectives and find common ground. While tensions still ran high, there was also a sense of possibility, a belief that change, however slow and painful, was within reach. Months later, Elijah and James crossed paths again, this time at one of those town halls. It was an unplanned encounter, but neither seemed surprised to see the other there. Elijah was on stage, speaking about the importance of accountability and the shared responsibility of leadership. When he stepped down, James approached him cautiously. "Director Pierce," James began, unsure of how his words would land. "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything, for not letting it become something worse." Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding. "And thank you for owning up to your part in it," he replied. "It's not easy to face yourself, but it's the first step toward real change." Their exchange was brief but significant, a small but meaningful bridge between two men who had started on opposite sides of a deeply fraught moment. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something close, an acknowledgement of shared humanity in the midst of a flawed system. As the town hall continued, both men faded into the crowd, their paths diverging once again. But the impact of their encounter lingered, rippling outward in ways neither of them could fully measure. For Elijah, it was a reminder of why he had chosen to serve, despite the challenges. For James, it was a chance to rebuild, not just his career, but his understanding of what it meant to truly protect and serve. The story, once sensationalized and polarizing, settled into something quieter but far more profound. It became a case study, a cautionary tale, and a catalyst for change. And while the nation moved on to new headlines, the lessons of that day remained etched in the minds of those who had lived it. In the end, it wasn't about a single moment or a single mistake. It was about the choices people made in the aftermath, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, the humility to learn, and the resilience to move forward.